So one thing about this unit, I will say, is there is absolutely loads of overlap with some of the previous units we've done. First bit that we're going to have a look at today is going to overlap with the genetics stuff that we did biochemistry unit, and then we've got loads that overlaps with the microbiology system. So we've covered a lot of this already, but we're just looking at it with a different context. We're looking at disease now. The diseases we'll be looking at as well. So first thing that we're going to look at is so for example, infectious disease, non-infectious disease, genetic disease, and have a from each category. First thing we're going to have a look at is disease that has or confirmed cause. So sometimes you just get diseases or symptoms really get to the bottom of what's causing the problem. A good example of this is functional gastrointestinal. Let me just move. I've got a little box in my way, as sometimes happens on Zoom. Common disorders with persistent and reoccurring gastrointestinal systems. These little boxes when you're presenting in Zoom, and sometimes they get in the way of this. So you can get just abnormal functioning of the gastrointestinal tract. When you have a look at the gastrointestinal tract, there's nothing there. There's no structural problems. There's no tumors. There's no masses. There's no bio showing up. So that's an example of an idiopathic disease. So there's obviously a problem. Just persistent pain in the gastrointestinal tract, but all routine, nothing shows up. Endoscope examinations don't see anything. Everything. Reason why this quite probably occurs. Materials with the external environment, our food essentially, that's in our guts. It's meant to be there. It's our microbiome. We've mentioned it before. It's got a really important immune role. And if you don't eat, disrupt that microbiome, which can lead to this sort of idiopathic disease. Next couple of disease types. You go see this table here says disease type down the side. We're going to have a look at is genetic and hereditary. We're going to have a look at these in literally just went over them last lesson when we were looking at the biochemistry. So things are hereditary if their effective gene, which is passed from the parent to the child. So we had a look at sickle cell, we had a look at all those diseases, but you can get genetic diseases which aren't hereditary, such as Down syndrome. This actually happens when the egg or sperm is formed. So although it's got a genetic cause, it's not hereditary. So you won't have Down syndrome parents passing on Down syndrome to their offspring. It happens in the formation of the egg and the sperm of gene mutations. So this is changes to the hereditary passed on from one to the next. Sometimes when the genetic code is copied, it gets altered in the process. So this, which we had a look at last session, the genetic code is copied before the cells divide into those egg and sperm cells, which you remember from last session, they've got half the amount of chromosomes as a normal cell. So we can get something called a mutation or a recombination. It's just where maybe you get an incorrect base pair put in place when the copy of the DNA is being made before the chromosomes are separated, or you might just get that it doesn't separate properly. Either way, you end up with a type of mutation. Here's some examples that we can get in humans. So these are chromosomal mutations and they're deletions. So part of the chromosome is deleted. You can see this is what the full chromosome looks like. And when you have this deletion, part of chromosome 5 gets deleted here, and quite often this ends in death. So if this happens before the zygote is formed or after the zygote is formed, it won't develop into a viable pregnancy. So it ends in spontaneous abortion or miscarriage. But there are some abnormalities in the genome that are survivable. This is one. This is called cri du chat syndrome, which basically means cry of cat because of the way the sound that the baby makes. You get very small, weak infants with a noise that sounds like a cat crying. Microcephaly, which means a small head, a broad face, and physical and mental retardation, which basically means slow development. Obviously, there's implications for that word. Retardation in the biological sense means slow development. So that's the phenotype, how that is expressed. The genotype is a short arm deletion in chromosome 5. So you can see on the chromosomes here, there's two sort of regions. So we call these arms. So this is the short arm and this is the long arm, because there's a little bit of a sort of waist almost in the middle, you can see. So part of the short arm of 5 but gets deleted. Here's another example of genetic abnormalities that can occur. This is called chromosomal translocation. Here's an example for you, a type of leukemia. Patient has leukemia, it's a disorder of the blood, and the genotype is part of the long arm this time of chromosome 22 is located to another chromosome. It's usually chromosome 9, and this leads a deficiency in chromosome 22. So if we look at the chromosome 22 pair here, this one's a little bit short. If we look at the chromosome 9 pair, this one's a bit long. So part of it has been, of 22, has been moved and accidentally stuck onto chromosome 9. So this obviously happens in the gamete formation stage when the gametes are being made from a cell containing the full number of chromosomes. This example here is non-disjunction of the sex chromosomes. So non-disjunction means failure of the chromosomes to separate properly. So here's an example, Klinefelter syndrome. What happens is the X chromosomes fail to separate properly during meiosis again, so formation of the gametes, the eggs and the sperm. So some of the gametes or one of the gametes contains 2 X chromosomes instead of 1, and this X chromosome, double X chromosome containing gamete, then fuses with a Y gamete, and the resulting zygote that forms is then XXY and develops into a sterile male with some sort of quite female body shape characteristics we had a look at briefly last session as well. So sterile male with female body characteristics is what we get with this non-disjunction of the sex chromosomes. Non-disjunction, failure to separate of these chromosomes in the meiosis process, which makes the eggs and the sperm. Alterations in chromosome number again. This is another case of non-disjunction of the chromosomes. This time it's chromosome number 21. So this is also called trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. It's commonly referred to, so you're probably familiar with Down syndrome. You probably even know somebody with it. It's fairly common. So what happens is the chromosomes, again, they fail to separate properly during meiosis, so formation of the egg and the sperm, non-disjunction of chromosome 21. You get impaired mental development, eyes that slant slightly upwards, and also heart defects are really common. And what happens to individuals with trisomy 21 is they have 3 copies of chromosome 21. So all of these conditions are, let's have a look, is the trisomy, 3 chromosomes for 21 there. You can see on that karyogram. So all of these conditions are due to deletions or translocations of parts of chromosomes or non-disjunction. So DNA not separating properly when the gametes are formed. This happens loads. It happens really quite commonly, and about a quarter, I think, roughly, of pregnancies don't develop properly and end up in miscarriage or spontaneous abortion because of these sort of abnormalities. But these miscarriages will happen very early on in the pregnancy. Women might not even know that they've conceived. They might not even know they're pregnant because they're not viable. But obviously things like Klinefelter syndrome, Down syndrome, the individuals do survive. So those are genetic because there's abnormalities in the DNA that's inherited, but they're not hereditary diseases. They're not passed on from generation to generation to generation. So they're a little bit different to hereditary diseases. Here's an example of one that we've already looked at. It's cystic fibrosis. The actual gene is named the CFTR gene, and you must inherit 2 faulty copies or 2 cystic fibrosis genes, one from each parent, to have the disease. If you get 1 copy of the gene, you are a carrier, which means you could pass that condition on to your offspring should your partner also be a carrier. So if both parents are carriers, there is a 25% chance of offspring having cystic fibrosis and a 50% chance of them being a carrier, with a 25% chance of them being unaffected. So let's have a look. If both parents are carriers, here's the cross. So that's meant to be a lowercase c. So we've got 2 copies of the dominant allele there, and that means they're healthy. 1 copy of the dominant allele here. That individual is healthy but a carrier. Same for this one. And then this individual would have the condition, 2 copies of the recessive allele. So there's a 1 in 4 chance with this cross, if both parents are carriers, there's a 1 in 4 chance of the offspring being affected. And basically you can have a look at these crosses. It's just a probability that we had a look at it last session as well. Now, here's another example, which is surprisingly and unfortunately more common than you would expect. This is what happens when medicine or treatment has been given to a patient that causes harm. So the patient was perhaps, yes, a bit ill, but then they're made a lot sicker by interventions by the medical team. There's been a very famous case going through the UK. I'll just play you this video so you can have a look now. Very famous case going through the UK parliaments at the moment. I just had thought that's not going to be a sharing, is it? Let me get that sound to you. 1 second. I'm not going to play all of this because it's quite long, but I just wanted you to hear the introduction to this news story.
Across Europe, America and Japan. What was different was how other countries responded, how authorities moved to investigate and in some cases prosecute the people and institutions to blame much, much earlier. In France, the former head of the country's blood transfusion service was jailed for 4 years in 1992 for knowingly distributing AIDS-infected blood products to patients. 7 years later, France's former Prime Minister, Laurent Fabius, was also charged with manslaughter, although later acquitted. In 1996, Japan's then Health Minister, Naoto Kan, tearfully apologised to victims of the scandal after personally exposing documents proving government culpability. Those affected were then offered some £350,000 in compensation. But even as the extent of the scandal was unfolding in the UK, the response was often one of denial and disregard.
So there you go. What happened was in the 70s and 80s, people in the UK were given blood that was infected with HIV or blood products that was infected with HIV. And the government knew about this for quite some time. The blood had been taken from blood donors and it was given to patients anyone who needed blood in an emergency, like a car crash or in surgery, and people who had haemophilia get blood transfusions very frequently. So there was a lot of people affected and had HIV transmitted to them through medical negligence, essentially. Loads of people died, loads of people lost parents. So it's very serious. And this is still going through the courts now, people trying to get compensation for this horrible medical negligence. So that's another type of disease. Where we're up to now is environmental. So this is when you get exposure to substances from the environment. There's loads of examples of this. So smoke from cigarettes, allergens from pollen, hay fever, skin cancer from the sun, asbestos is quite a common one. So smoking's a really good example of this. Cigarette smoke contains carcinogens, they cause cancer. Almost all adults' lung cancer is caused by smoking, and most lung cancer actually leads to death. Smoking also causes chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases such as chronic bronchitis, emphysema. And we know from when we were looking at the respiratory system, it damages the cilia, the bronchioles, and can destroy the alveoli. The airways become inflamed, mucus builds up, infection becomes more common. As a result of this mucus buildup, it's difficult to get oxygen in for respiration. Damage is permanent, and the disease often can't be cured depending on which type of disease you have. There's also the infection itself can cause asthma because it will block the lumen, the hole in the tube. You can see the mucus building up in this tube, blocking it. Another example of environmental disease is things that are caused by obesity, like diabetes, which is the body's ability to produce and respond to insulin. That becomes impaired if you get extremely overweight, and you end up not being able to metabolize sugars and carbohydrates well. Lots of glucose in the blood. You're at really high risk if you've got a high BMI, so 30 or greater. Basically, the more overweight or obese you are, the higher your risk. And it's thought that obesity, which obviously has an environmental cause most of the time, accounts for 80 to 85% of the risk of developing diabetes. Obesity also increases the risk of loads of other diseases, including atherosclerosis, which is a serious condition where the arteries become clogged up with fatty substances that turn into plaques, which harden the arteries, cause them to narrow, and then you're much more likely to get heart attacks and strokes because it's harder for the blood to get through. There's also another category of disease is degenerative diseases. So things like hearing loss with age or arthritis, where you get inflammation of your joints. Alzheimer's disease is a common type as well. It's associated with ongoing decline of brain function, affects memory, thinking, and mental abilities. The exact cause isn't really truly known, but it can be increased by poor diet, smoking, alcohol. Lots of things can increase your risk factors. So age is obviously the main risk factor, family history, depression, lifestyle factors, as we've just mentioned as well. What's actually happening is proteins build up in the brain. These proteins are called amyloid and tau. They form plaques and there's damaged regions in the brain. So this is a degenerative disease. It's progressive, develops over years with loss of function and mostly brain functions, but also physical functions because of the link of the brain to movements. It starts off with confusion, difficulty planning and making decisions. As it deteriorates, you have speech and language problems, difficulty moving around. Personality changes are common, hallucinations, low mood and anxiety as well. So an estimated 1 in 14 people over the age of 65 and 1 in 6 people over the age of 80. So you can see that age is the predominant risk factor with this. There is early or young onset Alzheimer's where people can develop the disease age 40 to 65 or even younger. So you can live for Alzheimer's for several years, particularly if you develop it at quite a young age, and it's a very life-limiting illness. People tend to die of other things while they've got Alzheimer's, though, rather than actually dying of Alzheimer's. But it's a good example of a progressive disease. It's a progressive neurological condition which can lead to problems with swallowing, which can then cause chest infections because people choke on their food, for example. So you can reduce your risk by stopping smoking, cutting out alcohol, eating healthily, exercising, etc. Another example, very similar, vascular dementia. It's another degenerative disease. It affects about 150,000 people in the UK. It gets worse over time, very similar, slowness of thought, difficulty planning, problems concentrating, mood and personality changes. basically the same symptoms as you get with Alzheimer's disease, but it's a little bit different to Alzheimer's in the way that it's caused. It tends to be diagnosed with brain scans. There's no cure. Again, you can reduce your risks by eating healthy, losing weight, stop smoking, exercising, etc. What's actually happening with vascular dementia is there's a reduction of blood flow to the brain. So it kills off brain cells. So like Alzheimer's, it's a loss of neurological tissue, but this is because of a lack of blood flow instead of that protein buildup and damage. You can have lots of mini strokes with this condition, which will kill off regions of the brain. Things that are high risk factors are things like high blood pressure and diabetes, the sort of stuff that puts you at risk of heart attacks. Parkinson's is another example of a degenerative disease where you get involuntary shaking of particular parts of the body, tremor, slow movement, stiff muscles, balance problems, and then you get things like sleep problems, memory problems, loss of smell. And this is due to a loss of nerve cells in part of the brain, and it leads to a reduction in dopamine. So all of these are degenerative, so they get worse over time. Parkinson's can be helped with physiotherapy and occupational therapy, medication, in some cases surgery. In fact, Parkinson's disease is getting much more treatable and people are responding fairly well to advances in treatment with Parkinson's disease. So this is actually quite a promising, more promising than the other two degenerative diseases that we've just had a look at. I'm going to just skip through these, but they're on there if you want to go through them and watch the recordings, because we're in a bit of a rush on this unit to get through all the material. The next type of disease is autoimmune disease. There's loads of different types of autoimmune, really common. Rheumatoid arthritis is an example. Lupus, multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. There's loads and loads of examples of autoimmune diseases. So what's happening in autoimmune diseases, and we've discussed this before in previous units, is the antigen presenting cells that we've talked about a few times. They present antigen fragments to these major histocompatibility complex molecules to immune cells, such as we see in the liver. And if this goes a little bit wrong, this whole process, the body starts to identify its own cells as foreign and so starts attacking them. So have a look now at this example of an autoimmune disease. This one is colitis. There's lots of different types. They cause inflammation of the bowel. You can get infectious colitis, which is caused by an infection, and you can get ulcerative colitis, and you can get Crohn's disease. Ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease are just in different areas of the bowel. You can get radiation colitis after radiotherapy. The symptoms include just really horrible, painful gastrointestinal problems. So diarrhea, rectal bleeding, abdominal cramps, urgency, so needing to empty the bowels very frequently. Treatment is made by colonoscopy and biopsy, which is really invasive and painful. So what's happening is the immune system, which has obviously evolved to attack pathogens like bacteria and viruses and to tolerate the body's own cells, the self cells, fails to recognize the body as self and starts to think of it as foreign. In autoimmune colitis, in things like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, what happens is the body misidentifies the self tissues or normal gut microbes as dangerous. It overactivates the T cells, macrophages, and B cells, which are present. You can see them here and here. And then it triggers this immune response, releasing inflammatory cytokines. So when they're released, the body goes into a state of chronic inflammation. You get ulceration where everything swells up because it's inflamed, and you get tissue damage. In colitis itself, you get unusual multi-histocompatibility complex expression in this area. So unusual proteins that shouldn't be there being expressed, and it can lead these T cells being flaring up. Another type of disease is nosocomial, and that means something that is picked up whilst in the hospital environment. Sometimes these are called hospital-acquired infections, or HAIs, instead of nosocomial. So this is usually you pick up some infection like MRSA or C. difficile. You might have heard of C. diff and MRSA. They're in the news a bit. So these are what are sometimes termed superbugs. They become resistant to one antibiotic, and then so they get treated with another antibiotic, and then they become resistant to that. And when they become resistant to all antibiotics, there's one methicillin which is used as a last resort, and that's where MRSA gets its name from. It stands for methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So Staphylococcus aureus is the name of the bacteria, and it's resistant to this last resort antibiotic, methicillin. So methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus is a proper superbug resistant to pretty much everything. So C. diff or Clostridium difficile and this Staphylococcus aureus MRSA are two examples there of those. Any questions while I just pop the next load of slides up? So lots and lots of different types of diseases, lots of different causes. Lots of them can be, and your risks can be really reduced by healthy diet, exercise, not smoking, and not drinking alcohol is the take-home message, really, with that. Some things you have absolutely no control over. Doesn't matter how good your diet is, you can't help what genes you inherit or what DNA you inherit in the case of some of these diseases. And then obviously you can't help the treatment that you get in hospital if you pick up an infection whilst you're in hospital, or you're given blood which is contaminated, for example. There's not a lot you can do about that. So lots of different causes and symptoms and disease courses with all of these different diseases. So let's have a look at the next part of this. So we also need to explain the role of microorganisms in causing infectious diseases and identify specific examples. Good news is we've covered most of this in microbiology, and this is the region here that we're looking at in our list of disease types. So let's just have a quick look at the ones we've considered already. So autoimmune, that's when the body attacks itself. So your immune system starts attacking your own healthy tissue. So Crohn's disease, colitis, multiple sclerosis, those sort of things. Congenital is when you're born with something like a cleft palate or cerebral palsy. Sometimes there's an accident during the birth process. Degenerative is things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, things that get worse over time. Environmental is things that's caused by your environment. So obesity, smoking. Genetic is things like Down syndrome, which happens during the formation of the zygote. So the egg and the sperm the chromosomes haven't separated properly. Hereditary is things like cystic fibrosis, haemophilia, sickle cell disease that we've had a look at over the last couple of weeks. Iatrogenic is when you have essentially medical negligence where a treatment has been given that is wrong or damaging. Idiopathic is when you have symptoms, but there appears to be nothing wrong. This actually happens surprisingly commonly. Quite often, people are just told to go to the doctors and they've got these symptoms and they just said perhaps it's psychosomatic or maybe you're overweight and that's what's causing it. But quite often it's just not known and it doesn't get to no one gets to the bottom of it. People pick up viruses all the time. That can cause problems. Just loads of things with these idiopathic diseases. What else have we had to look at? Nosocomial, so that's infection of surgical wounds, often with things like MRSA, C. difficile. We've got psychosomatic down here, which says there's a psychological factor like a peptic ulcer and asthma. So I would dispute that. Peptic ulcer tends to be caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. It took medics a very long time to find it. It wasn't found actually until the 1980s, and everyone thought ulcers were caused by stress, but really most of them were caused by a bacterium that was just really hard to grow in the lab. So you take a swab of all these people with ulcers and nothing would grow. But it wasn't because they were imagining stress that was giving them ulcers. It was a really hard bacterium to grow because it needed a very weird environment with not much oxygen, things like that. So I'd be very wary of labeling things psychosomatic. Asthma, I would say, is definitely not psychosomatic. It is caused by blockage of the bronchioles. Yes, stress might make that worse, but stress is a valid response to the environment. I'd be very careful of labeling things psychosomatic, but it is down there on this list. So anyway, we're going to have a look at infectious diseases now, and this is something that we've covered pretty extensively in the microbiology unit. So what's happening in an infectious disease is a pathogen, which is a disease causing microorganism such as bacteria, fungi, virus, is causing a disease. These are usually communicable. That means you can spread them from person to person. The ones that it's suggested as examples here are gonorrhea, which is sexually transmitted, rabies, which comes from an animal bite, and tuberculosis or TB, which spreads from person to person. So as we know from studying microbiology, the definition of a pathogen is a disease-causing microorganism. Examples are viruses. Here's some viruses. No cell structure, as you know, just some protein and nucleic acids in the middle. Loads of different forms. We can see a couple on the screen. We're all really familiar with the one that we get on the right because of the COVID virus. They don't grow on their own. They need to be inside a cell because they can't replicate independently. They need to be inside a host cell. So they need to infect a cell to make multiple copies of themselves. And then they'll cause that cell to burst and spread out. Viruses can get passed through the bloodstream, and they can get from person to person through the airways in droplets or through other routes like blood fluid. So when you get a disease, an infectious disease, there's a few courses that, or there's a set course that it will take with a few phases. So first one is infection, and there are many routes of infection, of disease transmission that you can see on the left there. There's loads. So we've got direct contact. That means you need to touch someone or athlete's foot. Ringworm can be spread by direct contact. So you either come into contact with the pathogen itself, or it can be left on surfaces like athlete's foot. It's a fungal infection, and you can pick that up off the gym floor or the changing rooms floor. So that's a good reason to take your sliders or flip-flops with you when you're getting changed in the change room. The airborne route is extremely well known after the COVID-19 outbreak. Flu is another example of that. Flu is actually way worse than COVID in terms of how easily it spreads and how dangerous it is now currently. Obviously, COVID originally, the original strains were very dangerous, but flu at the minute is more deadly. Eating is a very common route of picking up infections. It's called the fecal oral route, which, as it sounds, is feces to mouth, fecal oral. So if your food has been prepared by someone who hasn't washed their hands properly and gets contaminated with fecal bacteria, which is really horrible, and that pathogen then infects your gut. Drinking water is also a really common route of infection, particularly in countries that don't have clean drinking water, or if there's been some sort of disaster like an earthquake and everyone's living in temporary accommodation like tents. Really common things like polio, cholera, typhoid fever to break out. Obviously, there's the sexual transmitted diseases route, which you will have all learned about extensively in school. So pathogens are transmitted during sexual intercourse if you don't use the barrier method of protection, which basically means using condoms. They're transmitted through physical contact, either in semen or vaginal secretions or through saliva. Examples are chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, syphilis. You'll have learnt extensively about that in school. Transmission can be via blood to blood, so sexually transmitted diseases are often able to be passed through blood to blood contact. So if you're sharing needles, for example, in intravenous drug use, that's another route of infection. HIV will get transferred that way, and hepatitis B as well. And obviously anything that can get transferred in from blood to blood can be accidentally transferred in situations like that contaminated blood scandal that we were just talking about. And then this one down here is probably the most concerning to a microbiologist. It's animal transmission. And the reason this is concerning is because where all the new diseases come from. It's where COVID came from. It's where HIV came from. It's that new disease route into humans always. So insect bites are a really common route of infection, rabies, for example, or flies carrying things like malaria. But increasingly, just being around feces of some animals, bats are really bad for transmitting infections to humans, and eating animals that we wouldn't necessarily always come into contact with. Eating bush meat, it is described as quite often. That's where diseases will come from. So that's, as a microbiologist, is where you would be mostly concerned about. This stuff we're all well aware of. We know what's coming, we know what diseases are around, we know how to handle it. This is where disease X is coming from. And disease X is the next pandemic, the next unknown disease that we're not expecting and we don't know how to treat. And we've probably got no immunity. So it's when something all of a sudden comes out of nowhere. HIV, first recognized in the 1950s. By the 80s, it was wiping out loads of men who had sex with men and intravenous drug users. And obviously, then there was the COVID thing. But before COVID, there was another outbreak of a previous SARS virus, actually, in the early 2000s, late 90s, that happened. Can't quite remember when it was, I think early 2000s. But at the time, microbiologists were looking at that thinking, what's this? How are we going to survive? Is it going to spread? And luckily that one didn't. But then obviously that was SARS-1. SARS-CoV-2 was the COVID outbreak a few years ago. So that's the big worry. Anyway, those are our routes of infection. So course of a disease, the first thing that happens is you have to get infection. Could be through all number of routes, any of those routes. And then there's an incubation period of the disease. Now, this is the time where you've been infected, but no symptoms have appeared. And the length is really variable depending on the disease. Some diseases, it can be like 3 weeks. I think COVID was three to 5 days. During the incubation period, the person may or may not be infectious, depending on the disease. But quite often you are infectious. So you could be feeling fine. You don't know you've picked up anything, but you're wandering around infecting potentially everyone you breathe on. So disease X will probably be airborne. It's the only way you really can infect people quick enough. After the incubation period is the time of infection where the symptoms appear. That's it. So time between when the symptoms appear. Then we get to the stage where the multiplying organism reaches a threshold. And at this point, the host's immune system hasn't got it under control and symptoms will appear in the host. So the person who's got infected is called the host. The immune system works really hard to try and control the disease during this incubation phase, but eventually you're likely to get sick unless you've been vaccinated or you've had the infection before. So a symptom of disease is something which is experienced by the patient, by the host. It's pain, it's fatigue, it's fever, something like that. It is possible to carry a disease and be asymptomatic, as we know from that COVID outbreak a few years back. Some people had it and they had no symptoms, but they were still able to spread it. So that's particularly concerning as well. So symptoms are very variable depending on the disease. They're very variable depending on the individuals that are infected with the disease. A sign of a disease is something which is measurable, like temperature, blood pressure, or weight loss. Symptoms are things that might not be, like fatigue. While we're here, honourable mention for flu, because it is such a huge problem for us humans. Wild birds are the natural reservoir of flu virus, but it circulates very nicely in mammals, bats, pigs, horses, dogs, humans. Subtypes of the virus are defined by the structure, the surface molecules. You can see them in purpley pink on this diagram. It's quite similar to what you'll have recognized with the COVID. These surface structures, they're proteins, some of them called hemagglutinin and some of them are called neuraminidase on the flu. So H for hemagglutinin, N for neuraminidase, and then that gives the flu its name. So you've probably heard people talking about H5N1 flu in the news because that flu, it's a bird flu at the minute. It's only really in birds. It's circulating at the moment. Everyone is really worried about it having probably it's only one or two mutations away from getting into humans. And when it does, it will probably kill a lot of people. So this is a subtype. At the minute, it doesn't spread human to human, but it's spreading through birds and killing wild birds. It's also getting into wild mammals. It's been found in loads of different mammals, seals, minks. It's been getting into cattle in the US. And it's always worrying when diseases get into farm animals because then there's an easy route into humans. So we have this global influenza surveillance and response system, which monitors the spread of flu worldwide, and it informs the development of seasonal and pandemic vaccines. So old people, vulnerable people, if you've got asthma or diabetes, you might have to go and get a flu jab each year. This global influenza surveillance and response system is monitoring what types of flu are around, and then they decide which vaccines to give us. And that's based on these surface proteins, the H and the N. So we get vaccinated against the strains that are circulating at the time. There was a huge outbreak of flu in 1918, just as the First World War ended. That spread really rapidly because all the troops were moving back home from wherever they were fighting in Europe. So they all took flu with them. Massive outbreak, millions dead, way more people than died in the actual First World War. And that was a lot. We've come to think of something as a flu as not something that's not that bad because a lot of people say they've got flu when in reality they've got a cold. The flu is really nasty. If you get the flu, you're in bed for about 2 weeks, you're really poorly, and it kills you if you're weak, young, vulnerable, old. It is a killer. It's a very dangerous disease. So people get flu, it's not that bad, but it really is. And if we get a global outbreak, there will be millions of people dead. So it is very serious and has pandemic potential. So this influenza A subtype H5N1 is being watched very carefully. It's shed in saliva, mucus, feces of infected birds and other infected animals. It may get into other bodily fluids, such as milk, which is why it's such a concern that it's in cattle in the US. The current administration in the US has stopped monitoring the farms that are becoming infected with this. It's of huge concern to the microbiologists. I would say they're almost panicking that this sort of safety net of monitoring the situation has been taken away. It's very serious. The disease can spread extremely rapidly through poultry flocks. So if you had like a chicken farm or a turkey farm or something, it would just spread through it in days, wipe them out. 500 million farmed birds have been slaughtered to try and contain this virus. So it's really serious. I live in quite a rural area, and quite often my neighbours have got sort of small holdings and stuff with chickens and things on. Quite often we'll have notifications that chickens have to be kept indoors, housed. So there's a bird flu outbreak there. There are wild birds that might pick up and spread it to domestic poultry. It's a sort of rural area where people have got chickens in their garden and stuff. So that happens quite commonly. It's the sort of thing you wouldn't necessarily know about unless you were paying attention to diseases and disease transmission. But this is extremely lethal if humans catch it. The only good thing at the minute is it's not spreading particularly easily to humans from animals, and it's not spreading human to human. It's only a few mutations away from that, though. And if we get a couple of mutations and it starts spreading human to human, this could be extremely serious. And at the moment, H5N1 virus is regarded as the world's largest pandemic threat. But that being said, we tend to get blindsided. Look at what happened with COVID. All eyes were on flu, as they always are, because it's always a threat. It's always in the wings. We've always got our eye on the next big flu. And then nobody was ready for COVID, which was a different type of virus. So with flu, humans are not the only hosts and vectors. It definitely comes from animals, which are huge reservoirs of the disease. It's spread by airborne droplets, coughs, sneezes, you are infectious from 1 day before symptoms to 7 days after symptoms start. So quite a long time of infection. It's a really unstable virus, so there's new strains yearly, which is why we get an annual vaccination. You get small changes called antigenic drift, which gives seasonal epidemics the new vaccine each year, and antigenic shift, which is a major strain change. And this is where these global pandemics come out. Infants are at huge risk, elderly and chronically ill. So that if you've got asthma or diabetes, you'll get asked to come in. So we're familiar with the treatments, but it's a lot worse than a cold. So you can, if you're fit and healthy, be okay at home with rests, fluids, and things like paracetamol, which bring your temperature down. You have to stay at home until at least 24 hours after fever resolves. But to be honest, with flu, if you've really got proper flu, you won't feel like getting out of bed for almost a week at least, I would say. You can get antivirals for complicated high risk cases, and often secondary infections develop because your lungs become full of mucus. So you quite often get antibiotics for secondary infections. Quick look at HIV then as another example of a virus. We did have a look at it before. It works by infecting the body's immune cells. So that's a really good strategy from a viral point of view. It attacks the CD4 lymphocytes, which are the main defense of our immune system. They're necessary to activate B cells and T cells, which are needed to fight infection. So it gets in and it kneecaps the immune system straight away. So HIV virus itself doesn't actually cause much illness. You can get a coldish type symptoms maybe when you pick it up, but there's no massive problem caused by the actual virus. But what it does is it wipes out the immune system. So there's no protection against common infections that would normally be of little or no threat, and cancers. So once the virus has reached a stage that the immune system has been overwhelmed, patients get acquired immune deficiency system and they start to become really sick from these opportunistic infections that normally don't cause much bother, or these strange, unusual cancers which hardly appear otherwise. It's transmitted through bodily fluids such as blood and semen and blood products. So again, the blood products and contaminated blood scandal, loads of people got HIV. It's sexually transmitted. Unprotected sex you can transmit it, and through blood. So intravenous drug users are at risk as well. So barrier methods for contraception, condoms are important. Important not to share needles. So drug users are advised to use needle exchange, and blood products are obviously screened and checked these days. HIV, when I was growing up, was people used to be petrified of this disease. It was really scary because it was a death sentence. It's really easily treatable now. If you live in the West, it's just a chronic condition. You get drugs and you live a normal life. It's like having diabetes or something. So much more manageable. Another example is Ebola. This is another nasty virus. This causes a hemorrhagic fever, which means your blood clotting cells drops and you get uncontrollable bleeding from everywhere, your eyes, your mouth, your nose, your ears. It is a horrendous death, extremely painful. It kills 90% of the people who are infected with it. Doesn't tend to spread massively though, because people get so scared of this, they don't risk it. Whereas with flu, people are like, am I going to die? 30% chance, I'll probably be all right. With this, people are like, oh my God, this is horrendous and I am petrified of it. So people adhere to all of the advice, they keep well away, and it's usually contained really well. It's the diseases like flu that people aren't actually that scared of because they think they'll be fine that will spread. Things like this just get shut down, usually very quickly. And because you have to have bodily fluid contact, it's not as contagious as things like colds, flu, SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-1. So it's not as easily spread. People often caring for patients with Ebola that get infected. You can't get it from air or food or water. It's not as easy to transmit. People tend to be extremely careful. when they're dealing with Ebola patients as well. Once the professionals are in, it spreads initially when you've got patients caring, relatives caring for patients until the professionals come in all their PPE. My notes on this say there's no vaccine to prevent Ebola, because when I used to teach this, there was no vaccine. But the good news is there is now a vaccine. In the last couple of years, there has been development of a vaccine. So hopefully we will see the end to Ebola one of these days pretty quickly. There's a nice little video here showing how viruses, but this is particularly how the HIV virus gets into cells. So it's a nice little video. I'm not going to play it now, but you can have a look at it if you want to. I'm just going to quickly go through bacteria because these are another pathogen. So what we've got here is a bacterium. It has a cell wall to maintain its shape, a cell membrane, which is underneath the cell wall, which controls what enters and exits the cell. It's got cytoplasm, like a normal cell, human cell that we're used to seeing. And it's got plasmids, which are small sections of extra bits of DNA by here. And these often carry antibiotic resistance genes, which is a bit of a problem in hospitals because bacteria can pass these from one bacterium to the next quite easily. So they can share their antibiotic resistance very easily. It has flagella. Singular is flagellum. It's not flagellae like it says on this diagram. I'm not sure why it says that. It's flagella. And it has cilia. So this flagella are basically like the tails on sperm. And these cilia, these can help to move it along. They act as a little wave. These are pili, it says actually. It's hard to tell what they're meant to be on the diagram. The pili are little tubes that the plasmids can get passed along from bacteria to bacterium. So they are not plants, they're not animals, they're not fungi, they're single-celled organisms. Some of them are not disease-causing. We've got loads that live in our gut that really help us to look after our gut, digest our food. They produce vitamins for us. Loads break down food and are really important in the environment for breaking down dead bodies of other animals, for example. So they're not all pathogenic. And they divide like this through binary fission. So that means their division is extremely rapid. You go from one bacteria to two bacteria, one bacterium to two bacteria in 20 minutes in optimum conditions. So that means you can go from one bacterium to over 1 million in 24 hours if none of them die. So what happens is the chromosome is not like our chromosomes. It's just a jumbled up bit of DNA in the middle. It replicates, and then any plasmids and stuff that are in the cytoplasm also replicate, and it just splits apart. Dead simple. And here's an example. I'll just go through this example, then we'll stop. Cholera. It's an infectious disease which causes watery diarrhea, which can quickly lead to death in young children and babies through dehydration. It's transmitted by eating food or water, which is contaminated with the cholera bacterium. It's really common in places where there's poor sanitation, so crowding refugee camps where there's war or famine and people are in refugee camps, so there's not proper sanitary conditions, which is really sad because not only are people going through whatever horrendous event like war or earthquake or whatever disaster they've gone through, but then these waves of horrendous disease come pretty soon afterwards. Symptoms of cholera can begin very quickly after ingesting the bacteria, as quick as a couple of hours, or it might take even up to 5 days, depending on how fit and strong the individual are. Sometimes symptoms are mild, just a bit of diarrhea, but often they can be extremely serious, depending on the patient. Very young children can get extremely sick very quickly, but it can be prevented by ensuring water supplies are clean, which is the good thing. So dehydration can cause rapid heart rate, your skin goes a bit funny, everything gets dry, the inside of your mouth, your inside of your eyes, and it does cause death. It is very serious. So there we go. We'll leave it there, guys. We will pick up these bacterial infections next session. If you've got any questions, you can let me know. Okay, bye, guys.